I have met so many writers, both kids and adults, whose biggest problem is just finishing their book. And often they'll have great technical writing skills, and yet they can't reach the end. They can't reach that final chapter. I am Millie Florence, author of Honey Butter, which I published when I was 13 years old, and Lydia Green of Mulberry Glen, which I published when I was 15 years old, and hopefully many more books which will be coming out in the future. And this is about how to actually finish your book. Full disclaimer, this is just my opinion. As Austin Kleon says in his book, which I love, Steal Like an Artist, all advice is autobiographical. This means that when you're giving someone else advice, you're basically just talking to your younger self. 12-year-old Millie, I have some tough love for you. I've said this before, but I literally cannot remember a time in my life when I did not want to be an author. Some of my earliest memories are from when I was 4 or 5, whispering stories to myself at night when I was supposed to be asleep. Before I could type properly, I dictated my stories either to my parents and they typed them, or I got like a handheld recorder for Christmas one year and I just told all my stories aloud in there. I was really passionate about this. So obviously, as soon as I was old enough and competent enough to type my own stories, I made a habit of writing regularly. But I always struggled with finishing anything. This was not from a lack of ideas. Quite the opposite, in fact. I had too many ideas. After working on a single book for months and months and not even reaching the halfway point, I would get discouraged and then distracted by new shiny ideas about other stories, and I was like, oh, surely that's the one. And this happened over and over and over again. And by the time I was 12, I was aware of the fact that I had a problem. I also knew at age 12 that I really wanted to finish something soon, because I had the goal of publishing a book before I was a grown-up, which I defined as like 13 or 14. Looking back, I'm not entirely sure that this was the healthiest goal. However, it did push me to make a decision that affected my writing career for the better. So while a bit misguided, I'm definitely grateful for what happened next. You see, at the time I was working on a very cool but very complex sci-fi novel. I had written about 20,000 words of it and I wasn't even 1/4 of the way through the story. I had also been writing it for months and months. I loved the idea, and I actually still love the idea, and I might go back and rewrite it someday. But at the time, I just felt like I was writing and writing and writing and just not making any progress or really getting anywhere. I didn't know when I was going to finish this book. I didn't know how long it was going to be or supposed to be, and I was only on my first draft. I knew that something had to give way, so last minute I made the difficult decision to stop working on that sci-fi story, which I really loved, and sign up for NaNoWriMo 3 days late. This was my first time ever properly doing NaNoWriMo, and I was doing it 3 days late with a completely new story idea that I had spent 0 time plotting. And this story idea was like nothing I had ever written before. For one, it was very simple, revolving around only a few characters. It was also contemporary, and before this I had only ever written sci-fi and fantasy and just things that were magical and fantastical in general. Because it was my first time doing NaNoWriMo and I didn't feel like I could actually write 50,000 words in a month, I set my word count goal for 30,000 words instead, and that was about 1,000 words a day, which was even a lot for me at the time. Like, that was a lot for me at the time. And I promised myself that no matter what happened, I would finish this entire book in a month. Why did I choose to do this? Because I wanted to prove something. Not to my family, or my friends, or the world. I wanted, plain and simple, to prove to myself that I could actually finish a book. I didn't care if the draft was messy. I didn't care if no one else would read it. I didn't care if it was short and simple instead of the grand fantasy I had always been dreaming about. Because I knew that if I couldn't finish a book, then it didn't matter how grand those fantasies were. They would never be completed. They would never see the light of day. I just wanted, for once in my life, to finish something. And I also had in my mind a piece of advice that my former ballet teacher had given me, which was, I'd rather see a clean single than a dirty double. What she was talking about was something called PK turn, and what she meant was that she would rather see one of her students do one spin and land it, and like nail it and do it really well, then attempt to do 2 spins, which is more impressive, and do it sloppily. Translating that over to writing, I knew that I would rather write a short and sweet and simple story and know that it was good than attempt a grand fantasy or sci-fi and that was really complex and not really know what I was doing and make it a little bit messy. So I took on the challenge and I did it. I finished the first draft of my middle grade novella, Honey Butter, in 27 days. The draft was at exactly 30,000 words and it was a mess, as I knew it would be. But just the fact that I had finished was a major victory. And I had actually fallen so in love with this story that I actually went through the entire process of rewriting it, getting beta reader feedback, researching, self-publishing, and 9 months later, after I wrote the first draft, I published my debut novel, Honey Butter. My first book at the age of 13. So what is the moral of this story? And what's the hard advice that I learned from this experience? Well, sometimes less is more. I have met a lot of writers, like a lot, who have one of 2 problems. And that is either they have too many ideas, like I did, and they keep switching between them, or they've been working on one book, just one, for years, and they haven't even finished the first draft. To the people who have stuck with that one story for ages and ages, I really admire your dedication. Like, I really do. Obviously, I couldn't hardly do that when I was a new writer. And to the people who skipped from one story idea to another, you have a crazy, fantastical imagination, and there are lots of people who would love that skill. But either way, my advice for you is the same. If you actually really truly want to finish a story and write it well and know that you're writing a good book, put aside the big, complicated story ideas. Sometimes the reason it is so hard for us to finish things is because we're putting too much pressure on ourselves. If we know that this amazing fantasy trilogy is amazing, that's a lot of pressure to have to write an amazing fantasy trilogy. And by definition, that's gonna make it harder to be okay with getting through and pushing through and making it a little bit messy, because all first drafts are going to be messy. It's not like when you're learning to skateboard, the first thing you do is some crazy, fantastical flip off the ramp or whatever. No, you just start with going from point A to point B. And because writing is so cheap, like all you need is pencil and paper or a Word document, you have the same materials as a really professional, talented writer. It's true. If they can do it, then so can I. Yes, so can you. Eventually. But we all start at level 1, and there's a good reason for that. Of course, if you jump to level 13 in a math course, you're going to be confused and frustrated. And it's very similar for writing. If you're a new writer and you're trying to write something super long and super complex, yeah, that's gonna be really, really hard because you're not at that level yet. It is often the right decision to set aside those grand ideas just for now. I'm not saying forever. I mean, you guys know what my second published novel was. Lydia Green of Mulberry Glen, a fantastic fantasy that I had been dreaming of writing before I wrote Honey Butter, which was much longer and complicated and had magic and more characters and a fantasy world. But there is no way I could have written Lydia Green of Mulberry Glen if I hadn't written Honey Butter first. Proving to yourself that you actually can do something is half the battle of doing it. And once you finish a shorter, simpler story, once you've proven to yourself that you can do it, writing all those other stories will come so much easier. I know this may be really hard for some people to hear, and obviously you know yourself best, and you know your writing best. Another of my favorite quotes from Austin Kleon, Steal Like an Artist, is some advice can be a vice. So Take what applies to you and leave the rest. So, what should you do? What are the action steps from this advice? Set aside that long and complex and probably brilliant idea you're working on now. Not forever, just for a little while. Come up with a very simple story idea. It should involve a few characters and a simple plotline, and you should be genuinely excited about it. Set a small word count goal of around 20 to 30,000 words, and really stick to it. Don't let yourself go over. Give yourself a very basic outline of what will happen in the beginning, middle, and end. Nothing fancy. Figure out how your protagonist will grow and change and learn as a person over the course of the story. And figure out how you can demonstrate that change effectively. Character arcs are the most important part of writing a story. Give yourself a deadline that challenges you just enough. Write and finish that story. And once you're done, maybe you'll choose to go forward and edit and rewrite this story and see it to completion. That would be amazing. And maybe you won't. Maybe you'll move on to the next thing. What's most important here is that you proved to yourself that you could do it. At the end of the day, the fact that you sit down to write is a victory. That's all for now. Keep writing.